generally as humans, we tend to overestimate the risk and underestimate the opportunity.
Yeah.
But if you go out there and try, maybe the opportunity is much larger than you thought. Right?
I agreed.
Yeah.
I think also you don't know what you don't know. So sometimes that's good because actually the risk might be a lot higher than you know, right? But because you haven't calculated, you're probably in a better position than most big companies.
Yes.
But I also think that in this day and age, shamelessness is the new currency. The less shame you feel, the stronger you will be, the more successful you will be, at least.
Thanks again for joining us. Today I'm with an interesting guy that I've known for some time, Rama. Rama has quite some experience in the tech ecosystem, working for global companies. And today we are here to speak about, his career experience, the new thing that he's working on, which is quite exciting. Maybe Rama, for those who don't know you, maybe a brief intro about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Rama Afullo. I am Kenyan. I've lived in 6 countries so far. So Kenya, Botswana, South Africa, the Netherlands, Ireland, and the US. I'm a mechanical engineer and space systems engineer by trade. And I've worked as one of the first 3 employees of Tesla in Africa. Then I worked for Google for 5 years. And then finally worked for SpaceX briefly before deciding to quit that and start my own startup, which is called Satlyt, where we're networking satellites. And I'm sure we'll get into a bit more detail there. But really pleased to be here. Thank you, Eric, for extending the invitation for us to do something together. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Interesting. Rama, you've quite an experience, being one of the first Tesla employees in Africa at the time.
Yeah.
And I think I was having a conversation, with you and a couple of friends. You joined Tesla at the time when they're expanding to Africa, especially when they were setting up, solar kind of projects across remote areas, game parks. Briefly about your role during that time.
Yeah, sure. So at the time, actually, I didn't intend on working for anyone. I was busy starting a startup where it was called Entree. It was meant to be Tinder for business ideas, and I had this vision of it becoming the entrepreneurship app. And then I heard that Tesla was coming to Africa, and they were looking for 1 intern, right? And I said, why not me? So I did everything I could to get in front of the hiring manager, Evan Rice, who I'm still really close with, and we still have conversations at least once a month. And I got hired a few months later as the 3rd employee. The 2nd employee started the day before me, as he reminds me. His name is Andrew Payne. He's now the manager for energy products across Tesla in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So at that time, initially when I was hired to be at Tesla, I was hired on the energy products division, particularly on the Powerwall, as sort of an engineering and business development like manager of some sort. And initially we were selling batteries to the residential market for rich folks in South Africa, initially to have backup power at their sites. But I didn't really enjoy that element, and I remember a particularly prickly conversation where myself and Shireen was the head of marketing at the time at Tesla, were at a customer site talking to the customer, and they were really berating the house help, right, the maid, and making accusations of her, like sort of ruining the solar, like making a joke out of it. And this is obviously also racially motivated in South Africa. I remember thinking at that time that this is not something I want to work on for too long. But luckily, and unluckily for others, the CEO of Tesla at the time was acting very erratically and making modifications to our overall plan. So we didn't have enough battery cell production. So I got, the Powerwall that we were working on at the time was paused in terms of its overall expectations of delivery. And we ended up shifting over to, I shifted over to the Power Pack team, which was looking at overall expansion, doing a bunch of different power projects across sub-Saharan Africa. And I got to understand for 3 months working with them how they work, how sales engineering works, the sort of cross interface between business development and engineering, and used that as the sort of use the impetus of that to decide to approach the telecommunications market, which Evan had been looking into as well, my manager at the time. And I put together a plan. He said, okay, go for it, right? There's nothing to lose. And I ended up diving headfirst into the telecommunications sector across sub-Saharan Africa, and sold Tesla's first ever deals in the telco space, and that was to Econet, actually, at the time. And we had a bunch of other deals as well that would have gone through had there not been such an emphasis on the Tesla Model 3 vehicle, which was taking over a lot of our battery cell production at the time. So there was a lot going on, but I think all in all, that really set my career up to really be at sort of the interface between business development and engineering work, right? Okay. And to sort of use that cross-section to my advantage, because I see myself as a generalist.
But interestingly, what you did in university was engineering.
Yes.
Then you went into business development.
Yes.
But before you went to Tesla, I think you were at Google, right?
No. So I did my undergrad in mechanical engineering at the University of Cape Town. And then my postgrad, I did a one-year postgrad, it was like a mini MBA in management and business, also at the University of Cape Town. And it was after that I worked for Tesla for 3 years, and then I moved to Google after Tesla. Yeah.
Interesting. At Google, I know you did a lot with regards to the YC projects, the AI projects during there. I mean, briefly tell us about what you did around that area.
What I did at Google, or
at Google,
about AI?
At Google, especially the AI side.
So initially, when I joined Google, I was in sales in the advertising division. I was an account manager for Sub-Saharan Africa, and I was based in Ireland, focused on the financial services market, but I was also doing what they call a 20% project, which I think is one of the best things at Google, where you spend 20% of your time focused on a completely different project that would be beneficial to Google. And I decided to grow the app advertising industry for Google. And that, I think, gave me a lot of sort of different ways of working, because my day-to-day job was not super interesting. And ended up building that business and 10xing the overall revenue in that business within a year, right? So that was interesting, but still not completely satisfying. And my manager at the time, Brains Mashila, another still close mentor of mine, you'll see there's a typical path for me where I collect my mentors, who usually were my favorite bosses, right, in my past, right? And Brains Mashila, a South African guy, he was great, right? He really set me up for a lot of things, and he was pushing me. He said, Rama, go do something in engineering. Like, don't stop wasting your time here in sales. You've done enough, right? And he said, go to the US, go do engineering. So I said, okay, fine. So it was during COVID. I did really well, got promoted, and then I changed jobs over to be a technical a solutions consultant within Google Cloud. And that was now in the San Francisco Bay Area. So did that for a little bit. Didn't particularly enjoy the work, didn't really enjoy the team. But what I did enjoy was the exposure to the cloud environment, right? Cloud computing environment. And you can see telecoms at Tesla, now cloud computing at Google, and then eventually the SpaceX Starlink stuff, like all sort of Satlyt becomes an amalgamation of all of those. But I was in that cloud computing environment, and there was a particular, so I was working as a technical solutions consultant, or the technical account manager for Snowflake, GitLab, and Twitter. But the work with Snowflake, who do data warehousing, was particularly impactful for me, because they really have a frenemy approach to all the 3 large cloud service providers, to Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure. And I really enjoyed the way they sort of pit these big tech companies against each other, but also had a competing product. So they were all appeasing them, appeasing Snowflake, but also they had this competing product. So I found that interesting. So I became a professional cloud architect and a professional workspace administrator. And then finally, I decided to leave that team, and it was interesting because my role essentially got approved by the CEO of Google Cloud, Thomas Kurian, after I appealed to him to get my role approved. And there were layoffs a few months after that. So who knows what would have happened had I stayed at the team before that. So I guess that's just how it goes. And then finally, I decided to join the startups and artificial intelligence team as a global program manager within the VC and startup ecosystem, still with Google, and with the Google for Startups cloud team. And that was really impactful. I got a lot of exposure to a lot of startups within the overall ecosystem, to a lot of investors as well. Got to really understand how they work, how they operate. And this was right at the beginning of the AI boom, right? And so that, I think, for me was super interesting. And right near the end of that, I got my green card. And that changed the game for a lot for me, right, in totality. And when I got my green card, I just started making my plans. I knew, and we can dive into that in detail a bit later, but I knew exactly what I was going to do and how, and it sort of played out more or less the way I thought it would.
Interesting. I think at the time when we met, you were at SpaceX leading the expansion into Africa, especially that's when they were, the Starlink was getting less across the continent. Maybe tell us briefly about your role at Starlink before you decide now to leave to go to Satlyt.
Yeah, sure. So I had made a plan in June last year, and I said, I am going to, and I said this actually to my current head of engineering, like in June 2023, when I get my green card, I'm going to go to SpaceX. At SpaceX, if they're not doing something that is horizontally integrated and really incorporating other startups, really incorporating other companies and bringing other like really growing the space economy as a whole, then I'll leave, all right? But I had a thesis about what I would do, and I already knew what my business would look like. But I joined SpaceX in mid-April this year. I moved to Los Angeles, and when I was at SpaceX, I was one of, I think, only 4 or 5 product managers for Starlink. They call them product growth managers, but they're product managers. And my work there was sort of cross-functional. Can't go into too many details due to NDAs and arms regulations and all of that. But it was interesting. I think SpaceX is an interesting company led by a guy I don't necessarily agree with in almost any capacity other than he knows how to galvanize people, right, and make people work towards a common vision. And I know you've got questions about that. But the team was really good, really solid, very much under-resourced, right, but still punching well above their weight, and just doing amazing things, right? So I enjoyed that. I was doing some deals with them and Google, got some term sheets in that regard, and was here in Kenya, actually, that's when we met as well, trying to push towards really expanding some of the ways that they were entering the African ecosystem. So Kenya, of course, for me is home, right? At the end of the day, like, where am I going to get deported to? It's here, right? That's my frame of reference, right? And so I really wanted to have sort of that, like a solid ground here in Kenya, and they'd already, truth be told, been doing a lot of work here before me. They're already coming here and scoping sites out for things and trying to build for the African ecosystem, but really looking at Kenya as one of their main hubs where they would do that in. And I opened up some business opportunities for them, and then I didn't spend enough time to really see things come to fruition, but I think some of the work that I did with the team was impactful, I think. Yeah,
it is actually, because we speak to a lot of people that both at the telcos and different, so I think that work was really impactful. This is my own thinking as maybe what the public thinks of Elon is this, extraordinary guy, but you did ask me
what's my opinion.
What's your opinion? My opinion was, I think my thinking is good at sales. And I think your opinion at the time was is good at selling, making noise about what he does. Then I did ask you, do you think that's a key defining factor, say, in this age of any entrepreneur? But just having worked with Elon closely for that particular time, from a professional side, especially around the culture, and how it gets people organized towards a common kind, like, what would you say is like your honest kind of experience from, say, the lessons that you picked up working at both Tesla and SpaceX, and probably now what would you take from that into building Satlyt?
I think The safest way I can put it is that Elon Musk is an interesting guy, all right? And I have to remember that I've got employees who are depending on me, and so I should. I'm a tread sort of quiet, gently here. I think that Elon is really good at galvanizing people, at getting people to work towards a common vision, at people internally and externally being excited about the vision. But I also think that in this day and age, shamelessness is the new currency. The less shame you feel, the stronger you will be, the more successful you will be, at least in America at the moment. Right? And it seems to be something that's spreading globally. I don't necessarily have that shamelessness gene to the same extent as Elon or Trump or some of these guys might have. But I think that they really use that to their advantage, right? Like, I mean, we're here at Kenya Wall Street, the stock exchange is here. Tesla's first real profit came from, I wouldn't say a rug pull, but a bit of a crypto, a crypto exchange, let's call it that, right? Like where they allowed people to buy Tesla cars with Bitcoin,
and the
increase the price of Bitcoin, and then they said, oh no, Bitcoin takes too much electricity, it's bad for the environment. They'd already sold off their proceeds, and they got a profit from that, right? And I think the other thing when it comes to Elon and some of these guys is that when we talk about shamelessness, they are very aware of optics, right? And in some cases they really care, in some cases they don't. So in the cases where they care, for example, like if I was to ask you, who's the founder of Tesla? Whose name would come up?
Ed, there are two guys, Ed and...
So Mark Tarpenning and Martin
Ed, Martin.
So most people won't know that. Most people actually think that Elon's the founder.
Yeah, Elon was an investor into the company.
Exactly. So you've done the research. Most people don't know that, right? But at the end of the day, all that matters is the optics. They know that the stock will rise up more if people believe a certain thing about certain people, right? And believe them to be like these godly geniuses, right? Elon's, Sam Altman, etc., right? Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, etc. But they've got a very common archetype. A lot of them have very rich parents, right? And could just focus on exactly what they wanted to focus on, right? And I think that's something that we don't necessarily have the same luxury of in Africa, but those of us who do, like, I want to see us building, right? I want to see us building something.
Interesting. Rama, your story is quite interesting because originally from Kenya, but now building a global company. Global space company, that could work across the world. And not that we have, wealthy parents, or I don't have wealthy parents.
Me neither. Me neither.
But we have a vision. There's something we're working towards. Ideally, something that's never been built before. But then, how do you, in your view, right? How, like, moving into the future around, especially. I'm heading towards now what you're working, which is Satlyt, actually. Like, how do you see yourself building this particular company? In say, not that you grew up there, but you built those particular connections. At the initial stages, like, how is that coming along? Maybe in terms of, for you, it's difficult for someone to transition from, in a job that people think it's very lucrative, pays well, then transition to starting your own thing. You like, how was that for you?
I think for me, I've always had a North Star. I've been very lucky. For example, I bought the actual domain, Satlyt's first website domain 8 years ago. All right? So I've known what the name of the company will be. And then I first pitched the idea for Satlyt at a New Space Africa conference. That's really when I put together the idea. 2 years ago, the inaugural New Space Africa conference here in Nairobi, all right? 2.5 years ago. And Timidayo from that side of things, he runs that company, the Space in Africa company. They had a competition where they wanted folks to come out and pitch their business ideas, so I pitched it, and over there was an investor who was interested in investing at the time, but I turned them down and said, I'm going to wait for my green card because if I need this thing to have the best chance of success, it's probably going to have to be built in America, at least at this point. That's where a lot of the space capital is, and where a lot of people take risks in this regard. Right here, we have a whole bunch of other different problems for people to focus on. But in terms of the team, so far the team is 100% African. Right? My head of engineering, like it's Ugandan Congolese, at least he's Congolese and grew up in Uganda and then moved to the US, right, and got his PhD at Cornell. Very strong. Like I've got two engineering consultants. They're both based here in Nairobi, right? So very strong ties here, and of course I'm Kenyan as well. That's the only passport I have at the moment, right? So it's not. As much as I left Kenya when I was 4 years old, this is still home. So far the makeup has been coincidentally almost African. Like I could get the talent here. My head of engineering was a no-brainer for me. So there's been a focus from our side to build something merit-based, and for some reason, it just so happens that a lot of the African talent that I've been exposed to tend to be some of the best, right? So I think that's something for people to be cognizant of, because I've been interviewing folks from all over the world, and you find a lot of times that someone might have the diction or the right words that end up making a lot of sense for folks in the Bay Area. But really, at the end of the day, their talent base is exactly the same as here, right? Like they just might be a bit more aggressive about marketing themselves, right? Which is exactly what we're talking about in terms of how Silicon Valley operates, right? And attracts a lot of talent. There's also a lot of African talent in Silicon Valley, right? As well, that we get to sort of interface with. We've been very focused on building a product that will be global in its nature, while making sure we abide by the rules and regulations in America. Because space is a very specialized vertical, right? We have a lot of folks who, like space ends up being very tied to defense, right? We're not a defense company. We're a space company, first and foremost. We've been clear about that. But we also have to be aware of the different ITAR arms regulations as well as we build this thing out. But we hope to continue to expand as a global organization, and part of what we want to make sure we do is to have an entity here in Kenya. Okay, interesting. Speaking of Satlyt now, I think you describe it as an alternative. It's more of like SpaceX or Starlink is an iPhone. Yes. You're building the Android version of that. Yes. For say someone who is interested in the space but doesn't understand exactly, this hard tech. Like for someone who doesn't understand what exactly you're building, maybe explain it in a layman's language. So we are not going to be. I think the first thing to be clear is that we are not providing broadband internet from space, which is what Starlink does, right? But what Starlink is really good at. So first of all, many people might not know this. SpaceX's Starlink has 2/3 of all the satellites in space, and there are about 11,000 live satellites in orbit right now as we speak. So they have about 7,000? They have about 7,000, yes, satellites in orbit. Now, when we talk about Android versus Apple, so first of all, I'm an Android user myself, right? That's my default setting because it's horizontally integrated and it's an open ecosystem. And you can port over different types of app stores. Different types of apps can be in use. You can do a lot of things. Versus an iPhone, which tends to be vertically integrated, a closed ecosystem controlled by Apple. Now, Starlink has a very similar ethos. Yeah, even the cables. Exactly. Yeah, like, because I remember when we were getting our cable for the office, it wasn't long enough. So we had to find an exact or a longer version of that, which they're the only people who sell it, not that you can get in any other shop. Yes. Yeah, which is similar approach towards how Apple does their products and service. Like even the lightning adapter, which at least thankfully now the EU has forced them to adopt USB-C, right? But exactly that, right? Look, it's got its merits, right? It's a trade-off in either case, right? You can see Apple moving more and more and more towards a lot of the feature sets that Android has had for the last 10 to 15 years. right? Where you can move things around on the interface a lot easier, where you've got widgets, right? Like iPhone users only got widgets like 2 years ago. Android has had widgets since inception, like 20 years, right? So I see like a lot, and the USB-C, like we just spoke about, wireless charging took forever. And I see some similarities with that ethos with how SpaceX and Starlink operate. Now, what we're doing as satellites is we're networking satellites. So we're interconnecting satellites that previously weren't necessarily built to interconnect. Most satellites are built to collect data and just beam the data down from space down to Earth. We're trying to get these satellites to also be cross-linking and interconnecting with each other, right? And that provides a surface for a lot of different managed services that you could have in space. Right, so we're focused on the space-to-space communication side of things, right? I mean, theoretically, we could have some competitors, we could have folks who come in, SpaceX could decide to try and play in this, but from what I know so far, that is not in their plans. If they do, best of luck to them as well. They're already doing a lot of different things. But I think that what we're building, if it stands the test of time, if we don't crash and burn in a fiery death within the next year or so, I think we have an opportunity to create a really serious company that will have significant implications for the future of space.
Interesting. Just to understand clearly, I would think of the likes of Blue Origin being, ideally, you will be utilizing either the infrastructure that both the likes of Blue Origin and SpaceX have built, but you're only doing the interconnectivity to make them work seamless.
Yeah, I mean, we could do that, although we'd probably start with a lot of the smaller satellite operators, right? Which is some of the conversations we're having right now, right? There's some of the smaller operators. And so, I mean, Blue Origin, they have a satellite, they probably have a satellite side of what they're doing. But really, like, I mean, they focus on launch and they move really slowly at the moment. But we want to interconnect all other satellites. So if you're a satellite operator and you're listening to this, please contact me, find me on LinkedIn, right? Yeah, so we could theoretically interconnect anyone.
Interesting. With what you're doing, how do you envision, this turning out, especially what sort of services would be built on top of Satlyt? Yeah,
so one of the biggest things that I saw when I was at Tesla and when I was at SpaceX was that latency was one of the biggest issues. So if you don't understand what latency is how much time it takes for two different pieces of hardware to communicate, right? The lower the latency, the better. You want quick communication, just in general. And so I said, well, some of the ways they're solving for latency right now is by building more ground stations on the ground. That's one of the key ways that latency is reduced. Space-to-space latency is reduced by building more ground stations on the ground, which for me didn't make any sense. So I thought, okay, well, we have to enhance space-to-space communications. So there's a couple of ways we can do this. One of the ways is to pre-process data in space. So if we aggregate the excess compute of these satellites in orbit, we can combine this aggregated compute and pre-process this data. So that instead of sending down 2 terabytes of data for you to sift through, you end up sending maybe 100 gigabytes. So it's a lot easier. Secondly, when you look at the way satellites operate, as they orbit the Earth, they've got maybe a 10-minute window where they're connected to ground stations to deploy all of this data. If we take that same 2 terabytes, if there's cloud cover, they can lose a lot of data. If there's electromagnetic interference, if there's a number of different things could go wrong, and sometimes just the downlinking, the downloading of the data from space down to Earth is a problem. But what you can do is a process called federated downlink. And you can send your data as a relay over to another satellite for it to also continue that connection time with that ground station. So that increases, that overall connection time means you can download a lot more of your data. And there's a bunch of other managed services. You could train AI in space. You could conduct medical experiments in space as a result of this. But really the way we see ourselves is we end up being the cloud service provider for space. Right? Where you can do whatever it is you wanted to do in the first place, but now you've got this aggregated compute model. You can do so much more. You can extend the lifespan of your satellite. You can optimize the satellite to no end, really. And you can find different ways to continue to extend the different things you would normally have wanted to do on Earth, but might actually be more cost effective in space. Let alone the fact that we'll have reduced the overall emissions from Earth by people doing a lot of the things they would have done terrestrially here on Earth, doing that instead in space.
I mean, it's quite interesting because I know a number of African governments are looking at that space, even a number of developing countries. What opportunities do you see for, say, you have a team based here, and a lot of what's being done has not been I know the Kenyan government has a space project, I think, back in Malindi. But for them, I think they're working with an Italian company or government to launch into space. But they have, beyond that, they haven't figured out what could be the opportunities for government and private sector. From what you're doing, what sort of opportunity you see ideally for the private sector and government, especially in Africa?
So we've got some friends at the Kenya Space Agency as well. And I think, first of all, I'm glad that it exists, right? There's a lot of African space agencies beginning to exist, and that's really a good thing. What the number one use case we see from governments is data sovereignty, right? A lot of governments need to make sure that they have sovereignty over their own data, and that they can do a lot more with it, and they don't necessarily need to rely on other parties to be able to do that. So we want to partner with a lot of these government and satellite operators to be able to do that, right? We're always willing to have the conversation. We've had conversations with a few folks as well, but we could do more. I think there's a trade-off between actually developing your product and going out there and talking to people about your product, because then they expect to see a demonstration of it. So you have to be a bit careful as you step things up as well. But of course, we're getting some memorandums of understandings and letters of intent and starting to gather a little bit of momentum. But there's definitely space for us to play in there with some of these government entities. But beyond that, even when they're not working with us, I think every serious government needs to have a space program. It always sounds a little bit far-fetched. People think, why do we need that? We need help on the ground. But if you think about things like agriculture, right? If you've got a space program, you can see sort of what the fertile land looks like, even fires, or where the forest fire is happening, your mines, your natural resources, you can monitor everything. So that's just from the Earth observation perspective. But beyond that, the space economy itself will have significant capital for folks to be able to draw out from it, right? And if governments are trying to get more money to their people, why not do this in a space that is virtually untapped, right? And is continuously growing, and there's a sort of hockey stick curve coming out in the overall space industry. When I spoke about there being 10,000 satellites in orbit right now, we're looking at there potentially being between 50 and 500,000 satellites in orbit over the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, interesting.
Right? So a significant growth of, a couple of orders of magnitude is on the horizon as well. So if Africa doesn't tap into this and get involved in general, it's going to be detrimental for us as well, and we'll get further left behind. But one thing I'll add on to that is that we have the opportunity to leapfrog a lot of the nonsense that folks had to go through over the last 60, 70 years in the space industry, right? And we can leapfrog that and jump right into the cheapest possible time to launch satellites. Every African government should have satellites in orbit. It should not be a thing that they think about. Maybe every 5 African governments should have a launch capability, right? Why not, right? But I could go on.
Okay, interesting. Ramas, we come to the end of this chat. With regards to anyone across the world building their own businesses, startups in whatever industry, what sort of piece of advice will you give? Will you give them?
So I think what you've done is excellent, because you create a collaborative atmosphere, right? You reach out to people, like even just doing this podcast is a great thing. I hope other folks in the startup ecosystem can learn from you, because collaborating is useful. You gain a lot, right? You build relationships, and that's really all that matters, because people will lead you in the right direction, or they lead you in the wrong direction if they don't like you, right? So I think they need to start building out those relationships. The next thing is, if you're in a position where you could possibly build something of your own, and you see a gap in the market, and you think you've got the capability to do it, you should do it, right? You should go out there and do it, because there's too many reasons to not do it, but there's so many great reasons to just go ahead and try. What do you have to lose, right? Really, right? Like, especially if you're young and, you know, not only if you're young, but when you're young, you've got a lot fewer obligations. And maybe your visa papers or whatever are not the problem, right? Sort that out first. Go out and build something.
Interesting.
Try.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That, you know, that reminds me of a quote, something I was listening over the weekend by Jeff, that generally as humans, we tend to overestimate the risk and underestimate the opportunity.
Yeah.
But if you go out there and try, maybe the opportunity is much larger than you thought. Right?
I agreed.
Yeah.
I think also you don't know what you don't know. So sometimes that's good because the risk might be a lot higher than you know, right? But because you haven't calculated, you're probably in a better position than most big companies. But I think one thing I would say though is that having parents that enabled me and a family that enabled me, like even when we were not doing so well financially, they still were supportive of what we wanted to do, was very helpful. So I'm in a very privileged position to be able to say that even when finances were not in order, at least the family was supportive. And that allowed me to just go out there with confidence and do things. And I really hope that other people can draw from that.
Okay. Good. Thanks, Rama, for making the time, man. Looking forward to more such conversations.
Yes, I appreciate it, Eric. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone.